The UK flat market is the biggest scam in British property. The buyer puts down a deposit. They pay a mortgage every month. They pay service charges to a management company they did not choose. They pay ground rent to a freeholder they have never met. They pay insurance they cannot negotiate, and after years of paying all of it, the property is worth less than when they bought it. Every other property type in the country rose in value over the past year. Flats fell. The buyer is not building wealth. They are funding a system that extracts money from them every month and returns nothing. The deposit disappears into falling values. The mortgage payments go to the lender. The service charges go to the management company. The ground rent goes to the freeholder. The only person in the entire chain who does not profit from the flat is the person who bought it. Nearly 38% of new-build flat sellers across England and Wales sold at a loss in 2025. Hamptons confirmed the figure using land registry data. In the Northeast, the number climbs to nearly 65%. In London, it is over 40%. In Hammersmith and Fulham, 66% of buyers who purchased a new-build flat and sold it last year sold for less than they originally paid. The average flat seller who lost money had owned the property for almost 9 years. Across those 9 years, the buyer paid hundreds of thousands of pounds between the mortgage, the interest, the service charges, and the running costs. That deposit did not appear from nowhere. It was the holidays the buyer did not take, the meals out they said no to, the years they spent living with their parents to save faster, the overtime they worked, the second job some of them took. Years of their life went into building that deposit, and at the end of it, the property sold for less than they paid on the day they moved in. Every sacrifice the buyer made to get in was wiped out by a system that took their money and gave them back less than they started with. The buyer who looks at a flat listing and sees a price lower than the previous sale is not seeing a bargain. They are seeing the exit price of someone who funded the system for nearly a decade and still lost. The next buyer who enters at that lower price is not getting a deal. They are becoming the next person the system extracts from. And in London, the extraction is even larger. Next, London shows what happens when the buyer enters this system at scale. The average London flat lost £19,000 in value in a single year to January 2026. £19,000 is more than most first-time buyers put down as a deposit. The buyer who purchased a London flat at the start of 2025 believed they were building a future. They believed the flat was the beginning of something. The first step toward a house, toward stability, toward the life they were told property ownership would give them. They checked the value a year later and discovered they had lost more than they put in. Their deposit is gone in equity terms before they have made a single year of payments, while every monthly payment they made across that year still went out to everyone else in the chain. In Kensington and Chelsea, flats fell nearly 12% in a single year. Meanwhile, houses in the same borough fell less than 6%. In prime central London, flat values are still sitting nearly 25% below where they were in 2014. The buyer who purchased a flat in central London a decade ago and sells today paid hundreds of thousands across those 10 years. The property is worth less than the original debt. The total cost of owning that flat, the deposit, the mortgage payments, the interest, the service charges, adds up to hundreds of thousands of pounds spent on an asset that gave the buyer nothing back. The buyer who rents and saves is at least accumulating money. The buyer who buys a London flat and watches it fall is losing the deposit they already accumulated while also paying thousands in interest on the loss every year. They would have been financially better off staying in rented accommodation and keeping the deposit in a savings account. That is the reality that nobody involved in the sale is putting in front of the buyer. And once the buyer is inside the system, it locks them in. Next, the remortgage trap locks the buyer inside. The buyer who bought a flat 2 or 3 years ago on a fixed rate is approaching the end of that term. The letter arrives. The new rate is higher. The buyer sits at the kitchen table that evening and recalculates the budget they built their life around. The number that was manageable is no longer manageable. The property is worth less than when they signed. The buyer who put down tens of thousands as a deposit and watched the property fall has already lost thousands of that deposit in equity terms. The rate they are offered at remortgage is higher than the rate they signed at. not because of anything the buyer did, but because the property beneath them lost value while they were paying for it. The buyer cannot switch to a better lender because no lender will offer a competitive rate on a flat with worsening equity. They are trapped with their current lender at whatever rate is offered. The buyer's monthly payment rises by hundreds on a property that has lost thousands in value. Across a year, that is thousands more going out for a property that is worth thousands less than when the buyer signed. The system does not charge less when the buyer's position worsens. It charges more. And the buyer cannot exit because selling at a loss means finding the difference between what the property is worth and what they owe. And most buyers do not have tens of thousands sitting in a savings account after years of payments that left nothing spare. The money that would have been the buyer's way out was already extracted. The buyer is locked in because the system already took everything they would have needed to leave. And for some buyers, the system has not just trapped them, it has valued their home at nothing. Next, thousands of flat owners are living in buildings the system has declared worthless. Thousands of buildings across the country still cannot get the fire safety certificate that lenders require before they will approve a mortgage. Without that certificate, the lender does not reduce the valuation. They set it at 0, not discounted, not reduced for risk. 0. The flat is unmortgageable. The buyer who is inside cannot sell to anyone with a mortgage, which means they cannot sell to 95% of the market. The only buyers who will touch it are cash buyers who know the owner is desperate and offer a fraction of what the flat should be worth. The owner watches their home be valued at nothing while the mortgage payment, the service charge, the ground rent, and the insurance all continue in full as if the flat were still worth what they paid. In London alone, tens of thousands of households live in buildings classified as high risk. In Manchester, tens of thousands more. Remediation has started on some buildings, but thousands with serious fire safety issues have had no work done at all. The buyer inside one of these buildings cannot sell, cannot remortgage, and cannot escape. They are making full payments on a property the system has decided is worth nothing. The couple who bought the flat planning to move to a house when the baby arrived are still in the flat. The baby arrived. The second bedroom they needed is in the house they cannot buy because the flat they cannot sell is holding them in place. The job offer in another city that would have changed their career passed because they could not move. The life the buyer planned around the flat is the life the flat is preventing them from living. The buyer, considering a flat right now, may not know whether the building they are looking at has the certificate or not. The estate agent may not mention it. The listing will not flag it. The buyer finds out when the mortgage application is rejected or when the surveyor returns a valuation that makes the purchase impossible. By that point, the buyer has already spent thousands on solicitors, surveys, and searches. The system took their money before it told them the building was worthless. And the buyer who is already inside one of these buildings found out the same way only after they had already committed. And the forces keeping this system running are not going away. Next, the system is designed to keep taking. Service charges are rising faster than inflation year after year and have been for over a decade. The buyer who owns a flat for 10 years will pay tens of thousands in service charges alone across that period. That is tens of thousands that a house buyer never pays. Not a single pound of it builds equity for the buyer. Every pound goes to a management company that the buyer did not choose, cannot remove, and cannot negotiate with. Every time the service charge rises, the buyer adjusts. The gym membership gets canceled. The savings contribution gets paused. The car repair gets put on a credit card. The weekend away that was planned gets quietly dropped. The buyer does not talk about it because everyone around them assumes owning a flat means they are doing well. The service charge does not care what the buyer had planned for that money. It arrives and it takes. And here is the part that makes this a cycle rather than a cost. Every time service charges rise, lenders include the higher cost in the affordability check when the next buyer applies for a mortgage. Higher service charges mean the next buyer qualifies for less. If the next buyer qualifies for less, they can pay less for the flat. If they pay less, the flat is worth less. The charges go up and the value goes down. The people collecting the charges profit from the thing that is destroying the buyer's equity. That is not a flaw. That is how the system operates. Landlords are exiting the flat market in record numbers and flooding it with supply at the exact moment buyer demand is weakest. The buyer pool for flats is shrinking while the number of flats for sale is growing. More supply and less demand pushes prices lower. The buyer already inside loses more equity, while every payment they owe continues regardless of what the flat is worth. None of these forces have a clear end date. None of them are being resolved by the current government. The buyer who enters now is not buying during a dip that will recover. They are entering a system that is still accelerating. And the alternative that would protect the buyer is one that nobody in the chain has any reason to show them. Next, the option the buyer was never shown. The buyer being pushed toward a flat in a city may not know that a terraced house in a neighboring town costs the same or less. Their parents told them to get on the ladder. The financial advisor said property is the safest investment. The estate agent said this flat is perfect for a first-time buyer. The government created schemes to push them into new builds. Every trusted voice in the buyer's life pointed them toward the flat. Not one of them mentioned the terraced house in the next town that costs the same and actually builds equity. The areas where house values are growing, where deposits are savable on a single income, where the mortgage term does not need to stretch past retirement, are not hidden. They are just not being presented alongside the flat. Nobody involved in selling the flat profits from directing the buyer somewhere else. Showing the buyer the alternative would mean losing the sale, the mortgage, the service charge income, and the ground rent. The system keeps the buyer inside by never showing them the door. A terraced house in Burnley costs less than a one-bedroom flat in most London boroughs. A house in Hull costs less than what the average London flat lost in value in a single year. A house in Wigan connects to the same Manchester economy that a Manchester flat would at a fraction of the price and without the extraction chain attached to it. The decision is not flat or nothing. It is flat here or house there, and the same budget produces opposite outcomes. The buyer who puts £20,000 toward a terraced house in an area where values are growing has £20,000 of equity that is increasing every year. The buyer who puts £20,000 toward a flat has £20,000 of equity that is disappearing every year while every other party continues to collect. A decade later, the house buyer's deposit has grown by thousands, and their property is worth tens of thousands more than they paid. The flat buyer's deposit has disappeared entirely. Tens of thousands of pounds apart after 10 years, and the only difference is which system the buyer entered. If you are already in a flat, check what it is worth today against what you paid. If you are considering buying one, ask one question before you sign. Who profits from this purchase, and is the buyer one of them? If the answer is everyone except you, that is not a property, that is a system, and the data says it is working exactly as designed. Subscribe to the channel, because nobody selling you a flat is going to tell you this. This channel will.